Hello and welcome to Moneylife News and Views. I'm Debashis Basu. Now, more and more information is coming out on what is called tax terrorism. And nobody has defined this term. But for our purposes, let's focus only on something which should be very obvious to everybody. And that is excessive punishment for what appears to be very, very minor offenses. Let me give you an example of, or at least a couple of examples of this. In March 2018, a former employee of a multinational company was slapped with a prosecution notice. And this is under Section 276CC of Income Tax Act for failure to file his tax return for the financial year, which goes back to 2011 and 12. Yes, you can be slapped with a notice for something that goes back to 10 years ago. Now, he had earned a salary for a part of that year, and for the rest of the year he was self-employed. He was setting up his own consulting business. In that year itself, he had a very serious health crisis in the family, and so he failed to file his tax return by the due date. What he did file his subsequent returns, but this year he filed his returns a couple of years later. Clearly, we are not talking about tax evaders here. We are talking about somebody who forgot to file his returns or could not file his returns for whatever reasons, and then subsequently a few years later filed them. And he paid the interest and penalty on whatever was due. But in India, you don't get away so fast, even though you have paid taxes. The punishment for delayed filing is a prosecution. Yes, it is a prosecution with a jail term which can extend for at least 6 months and at the most 7 years, plus of course fine. The department issued him a prosecution notice to put him in jail, alleging that he willfully evaded taxes, which was clearly not the case over here. He explained the reasons for his slip and requested that prosecution proceedings be dropped, but the department would have none of it. They went ahead and technically arrested him. After all, we live in a new Swachh Bharat, and in that, Netas and Babus come washed with Ganga Jal, and the rest of us have to be taught hard lessons for failing to follow hundreds of different kinds of draconian new rules. In July 2019, he appeared before the Metropolitan Magistrates Court with great reputation, and of course, fortunately, he had a very good lawyer who managed to secure a bail for him, and he's now out on bail fighting his case. He has an option, though, to stay out of jail. For his crime, he can compound his offense. Technically, it's called compounding your offense. That very, very simply means paying extortion money to the government. Guess how much is this? How much of that is in this case? For failure to furnish returns of income, the default period will be computed from the due date of the filing of tax return and or completion of assessment, whichever is earlier, and compounding fees will be 2,000 rupees per day. In his case, on a rough calculation, this works out to be 16 lakhs for a tax amount of 5 lakhs, which he has actually paid. He's not a defaulter. He failed to file his income tax return only on time, within the right time. This draconian rule was announced only on 14th June 2019. So it's all, these are newer and newer rules under the second term of Mr. Modi. Now, here is another story. Very, very similar. So lots of people, I'm told some 80,000 people have been issued of this kind of prosecution notices in Bombay alone. Although I have no way of verifying this figure. Here is a financial consultant who inadvertently missed a small part of the income, which she voluntarily disclosed and paid. Same story. Missed the income, the first guy missed his due date for filing, discovered and paid. This lady discovered a part of the income, found and paid little a few years later. But she was also served with a prosecution notice and was threatened with a jail term. She paid off 12 lakhs as compounding fees, which is a form of extortion. The chief income tax commissioner told her that this is unfair, but she can't do anything about it. It's the law. Many people think that the tax terrorism is due to overzealous tax officials. Mr. Mohandas Pai, who's a strong supporter of the present government, a former board member, Infosys, is one of them. So he's talking about that tax officials have to be reined in. In fact, this is the dominant narrative. When the Prime Minister was recently asked in an interview about tax terrorism, he said, "It is a fact that some black sheep in the tax administration may have misused their powers and harassed taxpayers, either by targeting honest assesses or by taking excessive action for minor procedural violations." Somebody should tell the Minister and the Prime Minister that the excessive action for minor procedural violations is embedded in the law itself. Now, for instance, I'm told some practicing chartered accountants have told me that the threshold of launching prosecution for non-filing or a late filing of return is as low as 10,000 rupees. And this low limit has been brought in via the recent budget. Notices, hundreds and thousands of notices have been issued for prosecuting deductors who had made delayed payments for tax deducted at source. The law now essentially assumes that everybody is a crook. If you have later paid tax or deposited TDS with penalty and interest, you will still go to jail because of the delay. Well, the other option, of course, as I said, is compounding fees such as 2,000 rupees per day, which can run into lakhs of rupees. What is a solution to this? Tax experts, obviously, because they focus on procedures, laws, rules, regulars, circulars, and so on, they're calling for this section to be toned down and that circular to be withdrawn and so on. And these patchwork solutions might help to some extent, but they won't really solve the basic problem. The problem is the government itself. Apart from making tax laws less punitive, which is of course is needed, what is required is to rein in the department itself from setting so stiff tax revenue targets for the department officials that they are forced to go after us. Former Finance Minister Mr. P. Chidambaram was notorious for setting very, very difficult targets and thereby unleashing tax terrorism as we know it. This government is more focused than him and more determined and more organized. So you can very imagine the consequences. According to me, the real problem, the root of all this is finally big government. It's a giant monster which needs to be fed every day. Although a lot of our money goes into interest and salaries, the money raised is essentially tax revenues, direct taxes, indirect taxes, cess, and so on and so forth. And the monster of big government is getting bigger and bigger. So there is no solution to this in sight. There is going to be a continuous demand by the government to raise more and more resources from us, and therefore for tax officials to sort of deploy excessive force or have the tax laws themselves turn into really very, very punitive and draconian. I don't think there's going to be any rollback of that. Unfortunately, all this is known, and the Prime Minister himself knows this. After all, one of his 2014 pre-election campaign slogans was minimum government, maximum governance. Now, if there is less pressure on raising tax resources, taxpayers can be easily spared tax terrorism or tax extortion. My question is, how difficult is it to understand this? Thanks for watching.